Must have, critical, essential, necessary. It doesn't matter what word you use, they all mean the same thing. And all of those words describe the wide receivers in this video because I need these guys on as many of my rosters as possible. And so do you. Headliner Nation, it is time for my first must-have video of the offseason, and today I'm talking about my top wide receivers that I'm trying to grab in any draft possible. But before I dive into the data, I need to give away 4 draft guides because y'all crushed the like goals for other videos that I recently had. So congratulations to all the winners on the screen. These 4 were selected from my must-have or must-avoid ADPs for wide receivers and running backs, and then my riskiest wide receivers and riskiest running backs from a couple weeks ago. If you see your name on the screen, make sure you send us an email, info@thefantasyheadliners.com, from the email account associated with your YouTube handle, and we will get the instructions over to you right away so you can start diving into our draft guide. And we're gonna set another like goal for this video as well, but we are gonna push it up to 1,300 likes because I know we can crush this one. So all you got to do is like the video, be subscribed to the channel, and leave me a comment down below when we're done with the video. Which one of these wide receivers that I will talk about today do you most want on your rosters? And if we hit 1,300 likes, I'm picking one of you that comments to win a free draft guide. Listen, make sure you don't skip any of this video because the information I'm about ready to drop for you is absolutely critical to your fantasy football success this year. First up, we're gonna talk about CeeDee Lamb, and right now he's kind of going into the first, early second round. And when I did my must-have, must-avoid wide receiver ADPs a week or so ago, I talked about CeeDee Lamb as being a push because I was diving into him and not 100% sure yet. But after the research, I'm absolutely sold. I want him this year. Listen, I don't think people understand just how good CeeDee Lamb was in 2022. Because if you take a look at the wide receivers that had 100 or more receptions, 1,300 or more receiving yards, and 9 or more touchdowns, there was only 3 of them. Davante Adams and Stefon Diggs, and then the man we're getting ready to talk about, CeeDee Lamb. And why do I want to draft CeeDee Lamb? It's because he's an absolute menace from the slot. And for a couple of years now, I've been talking about, hey, Dallas Cowboys, please leave him in the slot all of the time and get guys for the outside that can take the pressure off. Last season, his 81 targets and 63 receptions out of the slot were both good for 3rd most in the league. But he ranked first with 867 receiving yards there, and he had 276 yards after the catch, which drops down to 6, but only reinforces the idea that if they have the weapons on the outside, that number is going to go up. But he's also one of the most physical slot wide receivers in the NFL because he had 9 contested catches last year, which tied for 2nd with Justin Jefferson. Now here is why that information is extremely critical, because he did excellent out of the slot last year, but I don't know if he really reached his ceiling considering the fact that the Dallas Cowboys didn't really have the weapons needed on the outside. I mean, let's talk about the leaders in targets for this Cowboys team last season outside of CeeDee Lamb. Dalton Schultz was 2nd on the team with 89 targets, and that was with missing 2 games as well. Noah Brown was 3rd with 74 targets, and Michael Gallup tied him with 74 targets as well, and he missed 3 games. And then you had Zeke showing up with 23 targets as well. And 3 of those 4 guys are now off the roster, which means the vacated targets will allow CeeDee Lamb to either hold steady at his targets from last season or maybe even see a little bit of a bump as well. I just mentioned it a second ago. The wide receivers on the outside for Dallas last year were not like real weapons. Michael Gallup wasn't even healthy the entire year, and Noah Brown isn't a guy that anybody is super scared of. But now Michael Gallup should be fully healthy, and he's a guy that can take the top off the defense, and you've added Brandon Cooks on the other side. Both of those wide receivers are not only going to command the top 2 cornerbacks to go to the outside more times than not, but they're going to require safety help as well, which is going to leave CeeDee Lamb in the slot facing off against nickel corners, which he will beat all of the time, or potentially getting some mismatches against linebackers. And if those safeties are helping over the outside, they are not going to be able to come up and help within the box where CeeDee Lamb is going to do his damage. If there were two areas that CeeDee Lamb could have been a little bit better in, it would have been big plays and his plays after the catch, because he had no receptions that went for more than 40 yards last season. And I already mentioned his volume stats from the slot were great, but his yards after the catch dropped all the way down to 6. And when you look at total yards after the catch, that was also an area that he lacked in everywhere on the field. So when you add in two deep threats on the outside, it is going to clear out the middle of the field and allow for CeeDee Lamb to not only work in that area, but then be able to pick up those big plays after the catch as well. And don't forget, another guy that worked in that area of the field last year in Dalton Schultz, he is gone. So a lot of those intermediate targets now could become CeeDee Lamb's with ease. When you take a look at the deep passing game last year for the Cowboys, it was non-existent. On attempts of 20 or more yards, Dak Prescott wasn't even close to the middle of the pack. His 50 attempts, 20 or more yards down the field was 19th in the league. His 22 completions on those attempts were only 17th. And his 689 yards on those completions, also only 17th. In targets of 20 or more yards down the field last year, CeeDee Lamb actually led the way with 26 of them. Then when you take a look at the guys afterwards, the ones that should be getting those deep targets on the outside, there was nobody there helping. CeeDee Lamb had to play this dual role out of the slot and on the outside last year without a whole lot of help, keeping him exclusively in the slot, with Gallup and Cooks hopefully fully healthy on the outside and Tony Pollard running the football is going to open up a whole lot of room for him to not only have those catches and that volume from last season, but to see those bigger plays as well now. So 150%, I think CeeDee Lamb is going to be in for a huge career year in 2023. All right, I got to move on to a guy that you've already heard me bring up a couple of times on the channel, but we are going to dive super deep into AJ Brown right now. And trust me, if you have any reservations that Dallas Goedert or Devontae Smith are going to hurt him, you need to watch this entire portion of the video. One of the reasons I love AJ Brown is because he's a guy that literally wins no matter where you put him or no matter where he is targeted on the field. We all know the dude is a huge playmaker, so let's talk about that first. Last season, among wide receivers that had 100 or more targets, AJ Brown ranked second in yards per reception, yards per target, and yards after the catch per reception. And a lot of that had to do with how he was targeted down the field. His 29 targets and 14 receptions on targets 20 or more yards down the field last season ranked 6th among wide receivers. He was 4th with 549 receiving yards. He was 1st, averaging 42 yards per reception on those targets. He was 2nd, scoring 7 touchdowns on those targets. He was also 2nd in yards after the catch and yards after the catch per reception. He was 3rd in yards per route run, and he was tied for 1st in contested catches. When you look for AJ Brown deep down the field, this guy wins, and he wins way more often than not. And that's why he has become a very reliable presence with Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles. But again, I just mentioned that AJ Brown wins wherever he goes on the field. So even though he is known for his big playability and what he does deep down the field, take a look at these numbers last year on targets that were in the intermediate portion of the field. So on targets that were less than 10 yards down the field, AJ Brown's numbers absolutely smashed as well. He had 65 targets, which was 8th in the league and more than Devontae Smith. He had 47 receptions, which was 12th in the league and the same as Devontae Smith. Then he put together 524 receiving yards on those targets, which was 5th. He averaged 11.1 yards per reception, which was 1st. And he had 248 yards after the catch, which was 5th. So once again, when you take a look at the targets that are 20 or more yards down the field, or take a look at the targets that were less than 10 yards down the field, A.J. Brown dominates wherever you put him. He truly is a complete wide receiver, and I don't think anybody realizes that. But for those of you that are doubting A.J. Brown because of Dallas Goedert, and most importantly, DeVonta Smith, this right here is the most important information you'll hear all season long. Dallas Goedert was healthy last season in weeks 1 through 10. Then he was injured and out weeks 11 through 15. Then he came back in weeks 16 through 18, even though he wasn't fully healthy, and had okay numbers. But first, let's break down the 3 stages of A.J. Brown here. In weeks 1 through 10 last season, A.J. Brown had 44 catches on 73 targets, with 725 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns, which averaged 8.1 targets per game, 4.9 receptions, 80.6 yards, and 0.7 touchdowns per game. And he was the wide receiver 8 during that time frame. Then while Dallas Goedert was out, A.J. Brown in weeks 11 through 15 had 30 receptions on 45 targets, 476 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. That averages out to 9 targets a game, 6 receptions a game, 95.2 receiving yards, and 0.8 touchdowns. During that time frame, he was the wide receiver 4. And then in weeks 16 through 18, when Dallas Goedert came back and DeVonta Smith really kind of blew up, he had 27 targets, 14 receptions, 295 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown, which comes out to 9 targets per game, which is the same as the weeks that Dallas Goedert was out. 4.7 receptions per game. He averaged 98.3 yards per game and 0.3 touchdowns. And during that time frame, he was still the wide receiver 7. Now let's take a look at DeVonta Smith's numbers right next to them, because a lot of you in a video that I recently did talking about A.J. Brown continuously said over and over that you don't trust A.J. Brown because DeVonta Smith could be the #1 wide receiver in the offense this year because how he quote unquote went off last season. While Dallas Goedert was healthy at the beginning of the year, weeks 1 through 10, DeVonta Smith had 61 targets, 46 receptions for 481 receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns. On average per game, that comes out to 6.8 targets, 5.1 receptions, 53.4 receiving yards, and 0.3 touchdowns. From weeks 1 through 10 last year, DeVonta Smith was the wide receiver 29. Then in weeks 11 through 15, when Dallas Goedert went out, DeVonta Smith took a step forward. He had 42 targets, 25 receptions, 420 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. On a per game average, that's 8.4 targets, 5 receptions, 84 yards, and 0.4 touchdowns. During that time frame, he was the wide receiver 10. He still wasn't better than A.J. Brown, even when Dallas Goedert was out last season. Now, this is the time frame that a lot of you remember from last season, weeks 16 through 18, when DeVonta Smith went off and helped some of you potentially win a fantasy championship. During that time, he had 33 targets, 24 receptions, 295 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. That comes out to 11 targets per game, 8 receptions per game, 98 receiving yards, and 0.7 touchdowns per game. During that time frame, he was the wide receiver 2. So even when DeVonta Smith went off last season as the wide receiver 2 and Dallas Goedert was healthy, A.J. Brown was still the wide receiver 7. But here is where things become very interesting, because I guarantee that very few of you out there remember that in DeVonta Smith's 2 biggest weeks, in weeks 16 and 17 last year, when he had 12 targets, 8 receptions, 113 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns in week 16, plus 13 targets, 9 receptions, and 115 yards with no touchdowns in week 17, Jalen Hurts wasn't even the starter. It was Gardner Minshew. And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is a huge piece of information you all are missing when you talk about DeVonta Smith killing A.J. Brown's value this season. Gardner Minshew was the guy that gave him his 2 best games last year, and Gardner Minshew isn't even the backup there anymore. Jalen Hurts has 2 guys on the field with him that he absolutely loves. One of them is Dallas Goedert, and the other one is A.J. Brown, and the numbers absolutely 150,000% show that. If you're skipping on A.J. Brown because of Devontae Smith, you potentially are making one of the biggest mistakes that you could make in 2023. You know what? After getting that worked up over A.J. Brown, I need to take a relaxing moment, and I think I'm going to spin that by heading over to Pristine Auction and maybe buying myself something sweet to hang up behind me. And if you're looking for some sweet memorabilia for your office, house, man cave, whatever, you should head over to Pristine Auction as well. And if you sign up for a free account using code word headliners, you're going to get a $10 coupon to use for your very first purchase on Pristine Auction. And let me tell you, you're going to get addicted quick. PristineAuction.com, code word headliners. They sponsor all of our giveaways in season. So make sure you head over there, show them some love, and find something sweet for your house as well. All right, now the blood pressure is down. I'm calmed down. Let's talk about my last must-have wide receiver, and that's my boy, Christian Kirk. And listen, we called Christian Kirk as a sleeper last year, and the dude absolutely went off, and I love to see it. But with the addition of Calvin Ridley, people are a little worried whether or not Kirk will hold some of that same value. And I truly believe that he does, because Christian Kirk worked basically out of the slot last season, and that's not going to be affected by Calvin Ridley on the outside. In fact, it's probably only going to help. From the slot last season, Christian Kirk ranked 2nd in targets, 3rd in receptions, and 2nd in receiving yards. His 4 touchdowns from the slot was also tied for 1st in the league, and his 289 receiving yards after the catch was also 4th. But 74.8% of his total targets last season came from the slot. And when you look at wide receivers that had at least 100 targets last season, that was the most from the slot out of anybody. And now here's why Calvin Ridley is actually the perfect complement to Christian Kirk and not a hindrance to his fantasy value. Now, it might take a little bit of time for Calvin Ridley to shake that rust off, but back in 2020, he was one of the best deep ball wide receivers in the league. His 36 targets and 16 receptions both ranked 1st in the NFL for wide receivers on targets 20 or more yards down the field. Then he was tied for 2nd with 475 receiving yards on those targets. So seeing as how Calvin Ridley will probably be exclusively outside and Christian Kirk will be exclusively in the slot, those are 2 different types of players that we're even looking at this point. If you're still worried about Calvin Ridley taking too many targets this year, there is potentially 161 targets that could be up for grabs. Marvin Jones left Jacksonville and he vacates 81 of those targets. But there's a bunch of targets left over from lesser players as well, where they spread the ball around last year, that probably aren't going to see as many this year with the receiving weapons that they have now. So even if you take a look at the targets for last year's main players and the guys who will probably be main players again this year, there's still more than enough room for Calvin Ridley to come in and not hurt Christian Kirk. I mean, Kirk had 133 targets, Zay Jones had 121 targets, and Evan Ingram had 98. Then Travis Etienne chipped in 45 targets of his own. Last season, Jacksonville attempted 596 passing attempts, which was 9th most in the league. So even if those main players that you see there take their target totals and move it over to 2023, give or take a few here or there, that's about 400 total targets. And if Jacksonville attempts almost 600 passes again this season, which likely they will, that's still going to leave like 200 potential targets for Calvin Ridley and anybody else on the team that would want some. Calvin Ridley, he's not stealing anything from Christian Kirk. These guys are going to coexist, and Trevor Lawrence is one of my main breakout candidates this year. I think he's going to have a huge season, and Christian Kirk will absolutely be right in the middle of it. Headliner Nation, I feel like this might be one of my best must-have videos that I've ever done. So make sure you hit that like button for me, and make sure you subscribe to the channel if you are new here. And again, if this video gets 1,300 likes, I'm gonna pick somebody that comments down below to win a free draft guide. Make sure you let me know in the comments, of all the guys I talked about today, which one for their current value do you want the most? But Headliner Nation, stay safe and stay healthy for me out there. Peace out, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.